Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, yes, the Wolves are only 1-2, and yes, they collapsed in horrific fashion in Atlanta on Monday. However, there are still some positives from the first week of play. We'll talk about all those on the show here today, from Rudy to the defense and more. Plus, we'll preview the Wolves matchup against the defending champion Denver Nuggets this evening, Wednesday night at Target Center. It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy hump day and happy Timberwolves game day. A difficult matchup this evening against the Denver Nuggets. We will preview that later in the show. Talk about what Denver's been up to so far this year. Spoiler, they're still really good. But I want to start with all the positives. And there are actually quite a few from a 1-2 start the first week of the season. We'll get to that here off the top. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. You can download that Locked On Sports Minnesota app today, again, on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. Also, I should mention, I've neglected to mention this last couple of times we've had a show on a game day. You can actually listen to the Wolves play the Nuggets tonight at 7 p.m. Central. Wolves taking on Jokic and, of course, the defending champion Nuggets on SiriusXM, the SiriusXM app, the SXM app, excuse me. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves. You can find the broadcast tonight on SiriusXM. All right. As promised, I want to start with some positivity today. I flipped it on Tuesday's show. It was the postcast or the post-game pod, I guess. And it was in the wake of a frankly disgusting collapse on Monday. I mean, I don't know really how else to say it. I said as much on Monday or on Tuesday, excuse me, on the podcast. And then I talked some positivity after that. I want to start with the positivity today. Spend most of the show doing that because there is some positive to take out of the first three games of the season. And then we'll close with this Wolves-Nuggets matchup. So, number one, the best thing that's happened so far this season for the Timberwolves has been Rudy Gobert. He's been the most consistent performer on this team through three games. Yes, the highs for Ant have been higher. Yes, well, actually, Cat hasn't been all that good. He's had a couple of flashes. There's other, Jaden McDaniels was great in his first game, right? He's only played the one game. Ant had a really good game against Miami and moments that were great in game one and game three. But Rudy Gobert has been the most consistent player for this Timberwolves team so far this season. And there's really no way around that. Rebounding the basketball, Rudy's been fantastic. He's had double-doubles in all three games so far this season. Remarkably consistent numbers in his game log. I'm going to pull those exact numbers up to just kind of illustrate the point. But that, it's not simply the box score that tells us that, right? When the Wolves got out to the big lead against the Hawks on Monday, they were clearly trying, I don't want to say force the issue because that was the case often last season when the offense was not running well at all. The Wolves are trying to force the issue to Rudy. They were simply looking for him, and he caught several lobs. I think maybe 5 of his 7 baskets came off of lobs. The others came off of offensive rebounds. It might have been 4 of 7 makes in Monday's loss to Atlanta. But they were looking for him in the paint around the basket, lobs from Cat, lobs from Conley. And Rudy's finishing through contact. He had an and one on a lob. I think that was the Cat pass. Stuff we did not see him do early last season. And to be clear, it's stuff he was able to do in Utah. There's a reason he was seen as one of the 20 best players in the league for a couple of years running. because he was so dynamic around the basket. I think dynamic's probably the right word for peak Rudy Gobert. Not dynamic in the same way that Ant's dynamic, but for a guy of that size to be able to finish through contact, catch lobs, do all that stuff around the basket, and look like, dare I say, he's looked nimble early this season, which is the furthest descriptor from what I would have used last year at this time, or really at any point last season, coming off of the Eurobasket performance. It just never looked like the Rudy Gobert the Wolves thought they were getting. He just seemed like he was playing in mud for most of last season. And, all of the caveats of only being 3 games in apply here, but he's put up lines of 15 and 13 in game 1, 14 and 14 in game 2, and 14 and 13 in game 3. He has, through 3 games, he has 15 total offensive rebounds. This is a team that, 15, that's right. Last year, they were a poor offensive rebounding team. 2 years ago, with Jared Vanderbilt in the mix, the Wolves were a very good offensive rebounding team. Obviously, a huge influence on the success or lack of success on the offensive glass is going to be the biggest player on the floor for you and the player who spends the most time around the rim. And through 3 games, that's been Rudy Gobert, and he's been fantastic. I said a minute ago, Rudy scored 6 or 7 baskets against Atlanta. That was against Miami. Against Atlanta, he was 3 of 7, and I believe 2 of his 3 baskets were lobs. So in both of those games, the Wolves were looking for him around the rim. And to be clear, I don't want this to sound like simply the Wolves are playing better offensively, because for chunks of the first 3 games, that hasn't been the case. We've talked about that quite a bit. But it's because Rudy's finding himself open and is catching those lobs. Now, there was never a chemistry between Rudy Gobert and D'Angelo Russell, and there's probably equal blame to be shared there. But we know that Rudy has that natural chemistry with Mike Conley. We know that he's had some with Karl-Anthony Towns, right? Remember the first 20 games last year? Cat and Rudy actually had some high-low chemistry. And I said frequently last season, hey, the problem is not the Cat-Rudy pairing. It's the D'Lo-Rudy pairing. It's the Ant-Rudy pairing. Rudy Gobert is not figuring out how to play offensively with the Wolves guards, and the Wolves guards are not doing their part either. Well, now, fast forward a year, and Cat's back. Rudy and Cat together, other than occasionally when the offense looks clunky because of their presence on the floor, the actual spacing between the two has been decent. There have been some times, yes, where Rudy's been in the way. The spacing hasn't been great when Ant's trying to attack, and that's something that the Wolves are just simply going to have to figure out on the fly and play through. But in general, and I'm not going to pull on-off numbers yet. I'm not going to pull like, hey, a Wolves offense with Rudy versus with Rudy off the floor. I don't want to do that quite yet. But when this Wolves offense has been running really well, like think second half against Miami on Saturday and first half against Atlanta on Monday, Rudy's been on the floor for most of it, right? The second half against Miami, it was going well. They had to pull him when Miami went to the zone because they wanted to have Nas or Cat or Kyle Anderson in the middle of it. That's not Rudy's strength. But Miami went to his zone in the second half of that game because the Wolves were starting to score in the half court. Monday against Atlanta, the first half was lights out. The Wolves scored, 74, 76 points, something crazy in the first half of that game. And Rudy was a huge part of building that lead because he was so active on the glass. He was shutting things down on the defensive glass, which we will talk more about. I want to talk defensive rebounding here in a minute. But clearly, the most consistent part of the Wolves through 3 regular season games is Rudy Gobert. He's played 31 or 32 minutes in all 3 games. He's grabbed 13 or 14 rebounds in all 3 games, and he scored 14 or 15 points in all 3 games. He's also blocked 6 total shots over 3 games, which is an uptick from where he was last year in terms of his block rate, and I guess more crudely, his blocks per game. This is much more in line, again, through 3 games, with what we saw for much of his career in Utah. In fact, the block rate he's sitting at right now would be his best since 2020, 2021, and it would be right in line with his prime defensive years, which might have even been slightly before he became an all-star at age 27. So really, really good stuff from Rudy. Yes, he's 31 and we're 3 games in. We'll see how he holds up over the course of the season. The Wolves have a lot of rest advantages early this year. We talked about that back when the schedule came out, 2 months ago or whatever. But, the Wolves play obviously tonight against Denver, and they got 2 more nights off before they stay at home for game 2 of a 5-game homestand with 2 days off in between. The Wolves could pull out a win against Denver and sit at 2-2 with 2 days to rest before 3 more home games. the vibes are going to feel a lot different, 24 hours from now, right? And Rudy needs to have a big game against Denver. We'll talk a little bit about that when we preview that matchup here later in the show. But next, I want to get to the other positives so far this season. You can see it if you're watching on YouTube there on the side of the screen. We'll get to defense, we'll get to rebounding, and then we'll talk Wolves Nuggets. It's all upcoming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. You can score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get a $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's right. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. We talked Wolves over under before the season. I was an easy over on the 44.5. Also, by the way, in general, such a great time of year to be over at FanDuel. It's a great time to be a sports fan. We had the sports equinox on Monday, all 4 sports in action on the same day. And I guess minus football, that's going to be the case here for much of the rest of this week. World Series action continuing tonight. Obviously, the Wolves in action, NHL, and then football on Thursday, right? There's no baseball game Thursday, but you still have football. So it's a great time to get over to FanDuel. We're going to talk about the Wolves line against the Nuggets later in the show over at FanDuel. The FanDuel app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that include spreads, player props, over-unders. I talked about win totals as well, and more over at FanDuel. So again, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, a big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, every day as we'll do the post-game pod that'll post early on Thursday. A programming reminder, the live postcast is still a thing. It just is strictly over at the Locked On Sports Minnesota. We always have streamed the live video over at their YouTube channel. So go make sure you follow and subscribe there and watch. I believe tonight we'll have Tyler Metcalf from Canasupis, who joined me on the postcast on Saturday. He'll be with Luke Inman of Locked On Sports Minnesota. Go subscribe to that channel, and then you'll be able to find that audio after the fact on their audio feed as well. But watch the live video tonight after Wolves Nuggets. And then, of course, right here at Locked On Wolves, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts, the audio version, we will be talking post-game pod Wolves Nuggets on Thursday's show as well. All right. Additional positives that we've seen so far this season for the Wolves. Let's talk about defense. The Timberwolves defense has actually been, to this point, really good. Again, obviously all the small sample size stuff, all those caveats apply in a big way through 3 games this season. So I don't want to lean too much on the actual numbers, which sounds counterintuitive, but I'm just going to throw this out there right now. The Wolves, through games on Tuesday night, the Wolves are still in the top 10 in defensive rating. They're 8th in defensive rating league-wide. By the way, they're 23rd in offense, which is, yes, where they finished last season. They're 8th in defensive rating. They're 6th in allowing opponent points per game. The defense has been good no matter how you slice it, notwithstanding how horrible they were in the second half against Atlanta. But for the most part, we're seeing a really good defense from last year that finished 10th in defensive rating at the end of the season kind of roll forward to this year with a similar philosophy. And also, of course, Jaden McDaniels has only played in 1 game, and that was a game in which the Wolves defense was pretty atrocious. I said the second half, really minus the second quarter. It was bad all game against the Hawks on Monday. The second quarter was very good. Besides that, it was just very bad. Miami game, shorthanded Miami team, but still the Wolves, Miami still had some dudes on the court. Miami's still a good team, a well-coached team, and the Wolves were very good defensively. Ant has been his locked-in self when he's on the ball. We've seen Rudy Gobert, I mentioned him already, looking spry defensively, blocking shots, even though, like the Miami game, he didn't have a single actual block, but he influenced probably a half dozen shots at least, simply with his presence, and that's always one of those, like, it's very anecdotal, but it's a real thing. Like, Rudy being in the paint, opponents know he's there. Mike Conley's had some tough assignments on the ball too. He's for the most part been pretty good. Atlanta is a really tricky one. Obviously, DeJounte Murray went off, but that's a tricky backcourt to guard. In general, the overall defensive concepts have been good. We've seen Cat showing a bit on the perimeter, almost looking like you very rarely see Cat in drop. I'd like to go back and kind of chart how often he really is in drop, but I don't recall him being in drop much. He's mostly showing. He's mostly playing at the level when the Wolves are in pick and roll coverage and he's the big on the floor. He's the center on the floor. They don't switch very often. Chris Finch doesn't like to switch. When Rudy's on the floor, he's playing drop, and it's been mostly effective. So they're pushing the right buttons. They're pulling the right levers. And overall, defensively, and again, the numbers bear this out. 8th in defensive rating so far. It's pretty interesting. The the opponent field goal percentage isn't great. Like they're 21st in opponent field goal percentage. Sorry, I said that backwards. The Wolves three-point percentage against opponents is not great. They're allowing almost a 39% clip, which is 23rd in the league in terms of opponent 3-point percentage. The overall opponent field goal percentage is not too bad. It's about 45%, which is 12th in the league. Very crude way to measure defense. I get that, but through 3 games, we're looking at some of those different underlying numbers. The defensive rebounding, by the way, we're going to talk about that in a second. That contributes to the defense as well, and that's been outstanding. So all those factors together mean that in general, the Wolves have played good defensively. They held Toronto under 100 points in what was a brutal offensive performance. They held Miami under 100 points in what was a very good all-around performance when it was all said and done. And then Monday was mostly a debacle from, mostly defensively from start to finish, sans, the second quarter, which was decent. But offensively, the second half was a debacle too, right? So, there's caveats to all these games, right? The Toronto game was the opener. So, who knows what, it's the opener. It's always weird, right? Like Wolves openers traditionally are low scoring. Like if you go back and look at the last couple of years, they just are. The Miami game, a lot of guys rested. No Jimmy Butler, no Kevin Love, etc. Monday was just a terrible game. There is no other, Atlanta, was on the second night of a back-to-back, had traveled. The Wolves were at full strength, including Jaden McDaniels, and turned in a complete stinker for the final 24 minutes of that game. So there's these weird push and pull caveats to each game so far. But in general, the defense has been encouraging so far this year. And again, kind of rolled forward from what we saw last year. And it was also very good. The last positive I want to talk about is the rebounding I alluded to a moment ago, which is defensive rebounding is a huge part of defense. It's been a while since I've given my my 2-liner on why it's so important and why it is indeed a big part of defense. So I'll give it real quick. How do you end a possession defensively as an NBA team or as a basketball team, period, right? It's either a made shot, a missed shot / rebound, or it's a turnover. Those are the only ways that you're ending a possession. So if the opponent's making a shot, that's a bad thing. If they're turning it over, great, but that's also a little bit of a fluky. It's very much opponent dependent. Like it's not always consistent. Yes, there's teams that force turnovers more than others, but it's a less consistent and reliable way to stop possessions. See the Timberwolves from 2 years ago as an example, right? And then the third way is to secure a defensive rebound, because if you don't and they miss and they keep getting the rebound, they're eventually going to score, right? It's obvious. It's basketball 101, but I think sometimes it can easily be forgotten. That is defense, right? Rebounding is defense. Obviously, you want to force them into a tough shot, so it's more likely they miss it, right? But you have to end the possession somehow. It's either turning them over, allowing them to make a shot, or it's grabbing a defensive rebound. Through 3 games, the Timberwolves are number 1 in defensive rebound rate in the league, an 84.4% clip, which is an absolute shocker given how bad they've been the last couple of seasons on the defensive glass. Even 2 years ago, when they were very good on the offensive glass, they were miserable on the defensive glass. Last year with Rudy Gobert, who pound for pound was about the best rebounder in the league the couple years prior, I think literally led the league in defensive rebounding in his final year in Utah. They were one of the worst defensive rebounding teams last year. Somehow, some way, they managed to do it. This year, they're at 84.4% through 3 games, which is a great number, number 1 in the league. And that plays into their defense currently being 8th ranked in terms of defensive rating at this stage. So defensive rebounding has been fantastic pretty much across the board. And one of my big things in the offseason was like, hey, it can't just be Rudy. It can't even just be Cat, who had a poor rebounding year when he was on the floor last year. It's got to be the guards. We're seeing that so far. Kyle Anderson's been okay. Jaden McDaniels has only played in the 1 game. Mike Conley's been very good for a point guard in terms of rebounding the basketball, and Rudy's been just fantastic. Carl's been, bounced back in the proper direction, and Ant has continued his ascension. Obviously, that opening night, was it 14 boards he had or something like that? It was crazy. But he bounced back after 2 against Miami with 6 or 7 on Sunday or Monday against Atlanta. So all that to say, if Ant can stay in this 9-10% total rebound rate, and Cat can be in the upper teens, and Rudy can hover around 20, the Wolves will be okay on the defensive glass. It's not quite that simple, because obviously they were terrible the last couple of years, but also a full season of Conley instead of D'Angelo Russell, and really anybody instead of Jalen Noel, whether it's Troy Brown, Nikhil Alexander-Walker. Those guys are going to rebound better than Noel did. It's really good to see the rebounding mark where it is at this stage. And again, that's going to play directly into what their overall defensive metrics look like too. All right, let's close the show here today by talking Wolves Nuggets. We'll do that here next. All right, the Timberwolves take on the Denver Nuggets Wednesday night. Of course, Denver is the reigning NBA champions, and they are also 4-0 in this young NBA season. Their schedule so far has actually been pretty difficult. In fact, strength of schedule stuff is ridiculous this early in the season, but I saw somewhere it's like, yeah, according to Basketball Reference, it's the second toughest schedule so far. Take that for what it's worth. But I mean, if you just look at their opponents, they opened at home against the Lakers in that national TV game that they ended up winning fairly easily, although it was close for a while. They won at Memphis. Of course, Memphis has been a bit of a mess, but they won by 4 at Memphis, which is not easy to do. They blew out a Thunder team that's otherwise looked pretty good this year. They beat them by 33, and that was the first night of a back-to-back. Then went home. They traveled from Oklahoma City back to Denver, which is like a 45-minute flight. So not that crazy, but go back home to Utah or to Denver to take on the Utah Jazz. And they beat Utah by 8. So they're now, and that was Monday night. So no rest advantage for the Wolves here. Although Utah, keep saying Utah. Denver played 2 games in 2 days, Sunday, Monday, but both teams had Tuesday off and have been in Minnesota. So Wolves at home to take on the 4-0 Nuggets. The Nuggets so far this season, it's more of the same. Like they have a top 5 defense, a top 10 offense. It's obviously a tough matchup for anybody. I think the way I would describe Denver so far this year is they've been surgical offensively. They're number 8 in offensive rating. None of the peripheral numbers in terms of shooting the ball or their efficiency numbers are all that impressive. They're 29th in free throw rate offensively. They're 24th in three-point attempt rate, which is unusual to see both those numbers, in the bottom 7 for a team that's in the top 8 in offensive efficiency. Offensive rebounding, they're 23rd in offensive rebounding. So nothing remarkable there. They've just made shots, which shows you that they've been getting to the right places at the right time and making the shot attempts they've had. They're number 1 in overall field goal percentage. They're number 1 in 2-point field goal percentage. They're number 8 in 3-point percentage. So while they're not shooting that many threes, they're making them when they get the opportunity. All that together means they're number 1 in effective field goal percentage, shooting at over a 60%, 60.7% effective field goal percentage so far this year, which is off the charts for a team mark. Jokic is shooting 65% from the floor, 43% from 3 for Jokic. Jamal Murray's been fantastic, 49% from the floor, 50% from 3 for Jamal Murray through 3, or I guess for them through 4 games. They're relatively healthy. There's no major injuries other than Kankar, who we knew was out for the season. So this is a healthy defending champion with most of their rotation in place, obviously swapping out Bruce Brown for, I guess Christian Brown now being a part of the rotation regularly would be the biggest change there, but Reggie Jackson in the mix there. This is a team that, even if the rotation isn't quite as good as it was last year, and there's a couple of, younger players, unknowns, Peyton Watson would be another one. It's still a really, really good team that's looked like the best team in the league so far this season. And their stars look like stars. Jokic and Murray have been fantastic. Aaron Gordon keeps playing his role. He's been unbelievable defensively to this point, as he usually is. My keys, if I'm the Wolves in this game, I'm going to throw these up on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see them on the screen. The Wolves have to try and replicate what they did in the playoffs. They actually gave Jokic his toughest series. If you look at his stats throughout last year's playoffs, they need to challenge him. And by that, I'm not saying they're going to beat Jokic because I'm not. If you're a Nuggets fan, you're watching this, or if you love Nikola Jokic, I'm not at all trying to take away from Jokic. It's in fact a compliment. The only way you're going to beat Jokic is by trying to take it at him defensively, try and get him in foul trouble, obviously, try and frustrate him, be physical with him as much as you can, and play bigs on him. Don't try and go small because he can obviously pass better than any big in the league and better than most guards in the league. Just try and go directly at him. The Wolves have 3 capable bigs, and last year in the playoffs, they didn't have Naz Reid. I think you just run Rudy, Cat, Naz at him, try and make his life difficult, play big against the Nuggets, and see where that takes you. Teams like to try and make Jokic a scorer. I still think it's pick your poison, and there is no good option because it's, I don't know, the multi-time league MVP who just led his team to the title last year, probably should have been a 3-time MVP already. He's going to score. He's shooting 65% for the field and 43% from three. But you'd rather have him do that than throwing passes to wide open, cutters and, facilitating lobs and backdoor cuts, etc. So try and make Jokic a scorer as much as you can. It's a dangerous game, but that's your best odds of winning, in my opinion, are to challenge him on both ends of the floor instead of shying away, because he's gonna be in the center of the action regardless, right? Try and make him uncomfortable as much as you can. Secondly, on offense, it's moving the ball, and this is more, maybe not an indictment, but more, I pulled this more from what we've seen so far this year from the Wolves offense. When it's played well, they've moved the ball, right? It hasn't gotten sticky. The Toronto game, bad offense. The Miami game, pretty good throughout. The Chicago game, Atlanta game, good in the first half. Ball got sticky in the second half. The ball movement stopped. Denver's been a really good defensive team. There's no question that it's going to be a challenge, but your best bet is to move the ball and, try and speed the game up, try and make Denver move their feet. Don't allow the ball to get sticky in isolation. That's exactly what Denver is going to try and make the Wolves do, and they'll be happy if the Wolves do it. And that leads into my third point, which is just run. Get out in transition and run the basketball. Denver is, again, a really good defensive team. They can play at whatever pace they want to play at, but they're generally speaking, they prefer to play at a slower pace. So far this season, they're 24th in pace. Last year, they were 23rd over the course of the season. Their preference is to slow the game down, play the half court, let Jokic do his thing. And, the Wolves need to try and combat that by moving the basketball offensively, being aggressive in the open floor, running when they get the opportunity. That was part of the problem late in the game against Chicago. I keep saying Chicago. It's the red and black that's getting me. Against Atlanta on Monday. I promise I know who they played on Monday. It was one thing feeding into the other, right? It was poor offense, sticky ball led to transition opportunities the other way for Atlanta, which was a terrible combination because the Wolves are so bad in terms of transition defense and have been last year and so far this year. So more ball movement on offense should lead itself to a more efficient offense, but also less transition opportunities for the other team. And obviously them taking the ball to the net is going to not give them those transition opportunities anyway. And Denver would rather play slow. But as I said before the game against Miami, one of my concerns with that matchup was even if the Heat want to play in the half court, the book is out on the Wolves, and it has been. You can run on the Wolves. So Denver will run if that's what's most advantageous, and the Wolves will be in a tough way if they do. So what's the best way to keep another team from running? Well, first of all, it's scoring offensively, having good floor balance offensively, and not allowing the ball to get sticky, because when that happens, inevitably, you don't have good floor balance and you're not getting back in transition because nobody's touching the ball. They're trying to crash the glass. They're trying to get offensive rebound opportunities, and you get beat back the other way very quickly. So again, my three keys for this one: challenge Jokic, try and make him uncomfortable on both ends of the floor, try and make him, assert himself in this game, move the basketball on offense from side to side, don't allow it to get sticky, and then related to that, run in transition as much as possible, get back in transition defensively, and that is going to give you a fighting chance against Denver. As of right now, the line over with our friends at FanDuel: Nuggets by 3. This is in Minnesota. Again, no rest advantage for either team, and a clean injury report at this point for both teams. Of course, obviously, Jalen Clark still out with the Achilles for the Wolves, and a couple guys probable. McDaniels and Shake Milton are both listed as probable on the Wolves injury report. So as of me recording this early Wednesday, it looks like both teams will be healthy, and we should get a fun matchup. Nuggets at Wolves. Nuggets by 3 is the spread over at FanDuel. You can also see on the screen there on YouTube, the over-under is 224 for this game as well. All right, that's all we have for you today. Of course, we'll do the post-game pod on Thursday morning, as I mentioned earlier. Check the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel for the live postcast this evening with Tyler Metcalf of Canis Hoopus and Luke Inman of Locked On Sports Minnesota. And check back here on this feed Thursday morning for the Locked On Wolves post-game podcast. Post-game podcast. It's a tongue twister. It's all a tongue twister. That's all we have for you today. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. A reminder, you can also listen to the Wolves play the Nuggets tonight at 7 Central. Jokic versus Towns, Murray versus Ant, however you want to frame it. Catch every bucket of the game on the hometown broadcast with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves on there. You can find the game broadcast with the fantastic Alan Horton. Reminder, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.